The dry wind moved through the village like a warning no one wanted to hear. Dust covered the narrow roads, the wells were nearly empty, and the once green farms had turned into cracked brown land. For 3 long years, the rains had refused to come. Every season, the people planted seeds with hope. And every season, that hope died under the burning African sun. At the very edge of the village lived a farmer named Kofi. His small hut leaned slightly to one side, held together by old wood and faded sheets of metal. Beside it stood his farm, weak, dry, and struggling. While other farmers at least managed to grow a little maize or cassava, Kofi's land looked almost dead. People noticed, and they never stayed silent about it. Look at Kofi's field. One man laughed loudly near the marketplace. Even weeds refused to grow there. Another shook his head. That man is cursed. Children copied the adults. Whenever Kofi walked through the village carrying his old farming tools, boys ran behind him, laughing. "Useless farmer," they shouted. "Maybe the crops are afraid of him." The children burst into laughter while Kofi kept walking quietly, his eyes fixed on the ground. Inside, the words hurt him deeply. But he never argued, never shouted back. He simply endured it. Even his own relatives treated him like a burden. His uncle often warned others not to trust him. Kofi's father was respected, the old man would say. But the son, he has brought only shame. At night, when the village finally became quiet, Kofi sat alone inside his hut beside a small lantern. Sweat covered his face from the heat, but he stayed focused. In front of him were old notebooks tied together with worn cloth. They had belonged to his father. Kofi carefully opened the fragile pages. The handwriting was faded, but every word mattered to him. The notebooks contained old farming methods passed down through generations, ways to protect soil, save water, and work with nature instead of against it. His father had believed the land was alive. And Kofi believed it too. He remembered the night his father spoke those final words before dying. Kofi had been only a boy then. Rain hammered against the roof while his father lay weak on a straw bed, breathing slowly. "The land remembers those who respect it," his father whispered. "Never fight the earth, Kofi. Listen to it, and it will feed the people." The next morning, his father was gone. But the village never forgot what the old man had once done. Years earlier, during a terrible famine, Kofi's father had saved the entire village using ancient farming techniques when every other crop had failed. Families survived because of him. Back then, people respected patience. They respected nature. But times had changed. Now the villagers wanted quick money and fast harvests. They used harmful chemicals, cut down healthy trees, and drained water from the land without care. They laughed at old traditions. And they laughed at Kofi for still believing in them. One evening, dark clouds finally gathered over the village. People rushed outside with excitement. Women prayed loudly. Farmers lifted their hands toward the sky. But the rain never came. The clouds disappeared by morning. Days later, the harvest season officially failed again. The village square filled with angry voices. Hungry families argued with one another while children cried nearby. Fear hung heavily in the hot air. Then the village chief stepped forward. His face was hard and full of frustration. "This village suffers because bad luck lives among us," he declared. The crowd became silent. Slowly, the chief turned toward Kofi, who stood quietly near the back. Murmurs spread through the crowd. "He brings misfortune. He's cursed." The chief pointed directly at him. "Since Kofi continued his father's strange ways, the land has rejected us," he announced loudly. "Every season grows worse. Perhaps the spirits are angry because of him." The crowd exploded into whispers and angry stares. Kofi felt every eye burning into him. A woman pulled her child away from where he stood. Men shook their heads with disgust. Even some of his relatives looked away in shame. For a moment, Kofi wanted to speak. He wanted to defend himself. But no words came out. He simply lowered his head while the village blamed him for a disaster he did not create. And deep inside, beneath the pain and humiliation, one question quietly grew stronger in his heart. What if his father had been right all along? The weeks after the failed harvest felt heavier than ever before. The village no longer sounded alive. The cheerful noise of traders in the marketplace disappeared. Laughter faded from the streets. Even the birds seemed to avoid the dry, broken land. Everywhere Kofi looked, crops were dying. Fields that once carried green maize now looked grey and brittle under the burning sun. Farmers walked through their land in silence, crushing dry leaves beneath their feet. Some fell to their knees in disbelief as entire seasons of work turned into dust before their eyes. The rivers suffered too. The main river near the village had once flowed strong enough for children to swim in during the hot afternoons. Now only small muddy pools remained between cracked stones. Women stood for hours waiting to collect a single bucket of dirty water. Livestock became weak day by day. Goats struggled to stand. Thin cows wandered slowly through empty fields searching for grass that no longer existed. At night, villagers often woke to the painful cries of dying animals. Fear slowly entered every home. Inside small huts across the village, families argued over food. "You took more than your share," one man shouted at his brother during dinner. "There's barely enough for the children," a woman cried back. Neighbors who once shared meals now locked their doors at night. The drought was turning hunger into anger. Ironically, the wealthiest farmers suffered first. Those men had mocked Kofi the loudest. They had used expensive chemicals and forced their land to produce more crops every season without rest. At first, their farms had looked successful. But now their soil was ruined. Nothing would grow anymore. One morning, a rich farmer named Jabri stood in the middle of his dead field, staring helplessly at the dry earth. His workers had already left because he could no longer pay them. "This can't be happening," he whispered. But it was. Soon the village market began collapsing too. Empty stalls lined the dusty roads. Baskets that once overflowed with fruits and vegetables now sat abandoned. Hungry children wandered between the stalls hoping to find scraps of food. Some mothers stopped eating completely just to feed their children one small meal a day. Desperation spread like fire. And with desperation came rumors. At night, villagers gathered around small fires, whispering fearfully. "The land is cursed," one old woman said quietly. "No," another man replied nervously. "Someone has brought dark spirits into the village." Before long, people began accusing one another of witchcraft. Fear made people suspicious. And once again, many eyes turned toward Kofi. "He works alone in secret," some whispered. "He studies strange old books. Maybe he angered the spirits." But the village chief refused to face the real truth. He never admitted that years of greed had damaged the land. The forests near the village had been cut down carelessly. Farmers planted crops season after season without allowing the soil to recover. Water was wasted whenever rain came. The earth had simply become exhausted. But nobody wanted to hear that. Blaming curses was easier. Meanwhile, far from the village noise, Kofi continued working quietly. Near the edge of the forest, hidden behind tall dry grass, he cared for a small piece of land nobody knew about. Every evening after sunset, he carried buckets, tools, and old wooden pipes into the area. His younger sister, Amma, often followed him. Unlike the others, she still believed in him. One night, as they worked under the moonlight, she looked at his tired face with concern. "Brother," she asked softly, "what if the villagers are right? What if nothing can save the land anymore?" Kofi stopped digging for a moment. Sweat rolled down his face as he stared at the hard soil beneath him. "Our father believed the earth could heal," he said quietly. "If we listen carefully, it will show us how." Amma nodded, though fear still filled her eyes. A few villagers secretly spied on Kofi from a distance. They laughed when they saw his strange methods. "He digs like an old man from the past," one farmer mocked. Another laughed loudly. "While we search for real solutions, Kofi plays with dirt like a child." But Kofi ignored them. Every night, he continued digging deeper into the dry ground. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. As his shovel struck the earth, the soil suddenly changed. The dirt below felt cooler, softer. Kofi froze. Slowly, he knelt down and pressed his hands against the ground. His breathing became faster. Moisture. Very small. But real. Hidden deep beneath the dry surface, the earth still carried water. Hope flashed through his eyes for the first time in months. "Amma," he whispered urgently, "bring the lantern." She hurried beside him and gasped when she touched the damp soil. "It's alive," she whispered. Kofi's mind raced. He quickly remembered the drawings from his father's notebooks, ancient irrigation systems once used during long droughts, underground channels, stone pathways. Water trapped beneath the soil and slowly redirected to feed crops naturally. Most people had forgotten those methods long ago. But Kofi had not. That same night, while the village slept in fear and hunger, Kofi began building a secret irrigation system beneath the land near the forest. His hands bled from digging. His body ached from exhaustion. But for the first time, he felt something stronger than shame. Hope. Still, beyond the trees, the village continued falling apart. Children cried from hunger. Families fought over water. And with each passing day, starvation moved closer to becoming a tragedy nobody could stop. The next morning, the village drum echoed loudly through the dry air. Boom, boom, boom. It was the signal for an emergency meeting. People slowly gathered in the center of the village beneath the giant baobab tree. Their faces looked tired and hollow. Hunger had changed everyone. Mothers held weak children in their arms. Old men leaned heavily on walking sticks. Even the strongest farmers now looked afraid. The village chief stood before them with several elders beside him. His voice carried anger and desperation. "We cannot continue like this," he announced. "Our crops are dead. Our animals are dying. The old ways have failed us." The crowd murmured in agreement. "We need stronger chemicals, faster farming, bigger trade from the city," the chief continued. "Anyone still following ancient traditions is holding this village back." As he spoke, many eyes slowly turned toward Kofi. He stood quietly near the edge of the crowd, dust covering his worn clothes. For a moment, he stayed silent. Then he stepped forward carefully. "The land is not cursed," Kofi said calmly. "The soil is dying because we forced too much from it. We poisoned it with chemicals and destroyed the forests that protected our water." Some villagers immediately shook their heads. Others laughed bitterly. Kofi continued anyway. "If we give the earth time to recover." "Recover?" someone shouted angrily. "Our children are starving now." The crowd erupted into noise. Kofi tried again. "There are older farming methods that can still save." "Enough!" the chief barked loudly. The entire village fell silent. "You sound exactly like your father," the chief snapped. "Dreams and old stories will not feed people." Then a familiar voice rose from the crowd. It was Kojo. Years ago, Kojo and Kofi had been close friends. They worked together as boys, hunted near the river, and shared meals during better times. But success and pride had changed Kojo. After becoming one of the richer farmers, he slowly turned against Kofi like everyone else. Now he stepped forward with cruel eyes. "You want to hear the truth?" Kojo said loudly to the villagers. "Kofi talks about saving the land, but look at his own farm. It's the worst in the village." Laughter spread through the crowd. Kojo walked closer to Kofi. "You couldn't even save your own family," he whispered harshly, but loud enough for others to hear. Kofi froze. Pain flashed across his face. The crowd became quiet again. Kojo smirked coldly. Maybe hunger follows him because failure follows him everywhere. The words struck Kofi like a knife. For a moment, anger rose inside him. His hands tightened into fists. But he forced himself to stay calm. Without another word, he turned and walked away while villagers whispered behind him. That night, heavy silence covered the village. Kofi made his way carefully toward his hidden farm near the forest. But the moment he arrived, his heart nearly stopped. The ground was destroyed. Several irrigation channels had been smashed apart. Young crops were ripped from the soil. Water containers had been broken open and emptied into the dirt. Someone had found the hidden farm. Someone wanted it ruined. Kofi slowly dropped to his knees. His breathing became heavy as he stared at the damage. Months of secret work destroyed in one night. Amma arrived moments later carrying a lantern. When she saw the ruined field, tears filled her eyes. "Who would do this?" she whispered. Kofi said nothing. Deep inside, exhaustion crushed him harder than ever before. Maybe the village was right. Maybe nothing could save this place anymore. He sat alone in the darkness long after Amma returned home. The dry wind moved through the trees while painful memories slowly returned to him. Memories he spent years trying to bury. He remembered the famine from long ago. Back then, he was only a teenager. The rains had failed just like now. Food disappeared quickly. Families became desperate. Every day, more people grew weak from hunger. Kofi's mother tried to stay strong for her children, but her body slowly became thinner. His little brother cried every night from hunger pains. Kofi remembered leaving home one morning, promising he would find food somehow. But he returned too late. His younger brother had already died in his mother's arms. Days later, his mother followed. The memory still haunted him. Even now, years later, guilt burned inside his chest. He blamed himself for failing them. That was the day he made a promise. Never again. Never again would he stand helpless while hunger destroyed lives. That promise was the reason behind everything he had done in secret. The hidden farm was never meant only for himself. For years, Kofi had quietly experimented with drought-resistant crops using seeds his father once protected. While others chased fast profits, Kofi studied plants that could survive harsh weather and poor soil. He had hoped one day the village would need them. And now that day had come. But the people hated him. As dawn approached, another disaster struck the village. The final water source, a deep community well near the center of the village, began drying up. Panic exploded everywhere. Villagers rushed toward the well carrying buckets and containers. People shoved each other desperately. Mothers cried. Men argued violently over turns. There's barely any left. What will we do now? Children screamed as fear spread through the crowd. By afternoon, several families packed their belongings onto old carts and prepared to leave the village forever. Hopelessness covered the land like a shadow. Meanwhile, Kofi stood alone beside his damaged hidden farm, staring at the dying village in the distance. Anger battled with compassion inside him. These were the same people who mocked him. The same people who humiliated him. The same people who destroyed his work. So why did part of him still want to save them? Kofi closed his eyes painfully. And for the first time in years, he did not know what choice to make next. The next week brought something even worse than drought. A brutal heat wave arrived without warning. It began quietly. The mornings became hotter. The wind disappeared. Even before sunrise, the air felt heavy and sharp against the skin. Then, day by day, the temperature climbed higher. Soon the village felt like it was trapped inside a furnace. The ground burned beneath bare feet. Roofs became too hot to touch. People stayed inside their huts during the afternoon, pressing wet cloths against their faces and praying for clouds. But no clouds came. Only sun. Relentless, merciless sun. The remaining crops gave up first. Whatever little green still clung to the fields turned yellow overnight. Leaves curled inward. Stalks collapsed into the dirt. By the third day, nothing was left alive. Even the strongest farmers stared helplessly at their ruined land. Then the children began fainting. It started with a little boy in the marketplace. He had been standing beside his mother, begging for food. Suddenly his knees gave way. He dropped into the dust. His mother screamed and lifted him into her arms. "He hasn't eaten in 2 days," she cried. Soon it happened again. And again. Children too weak to stand. Mothers too weak to cry. Fear spread faster than hunger now. Even the chief's family was no longer safe. His youngest granddaughter, a bright little girl named Ajoa, had always been the joy of his home. She used to run through the village laughing. Now she lay motionless on a mat inside his hut. Her lips were dry. Her breathing was weak. The chief sat beside her, holding her small hand, unable to hide his fear. For the first time, he understood what the rest of the village had been feeling. Power could not feed a starving child. Then chaos broke loose. That night, a man was caught stealing grain from his neighbor's storage basket. The neighbor attacked him. Soon fists were flying. People screamed. Old friendships shattered. Food became more valuable than trust. In another part of the village, a woman cried after someone stole the last chicken her family owned. "This village is dying," someone shouted into the darkness. And perhaps they were right. Then came the storm. Late the next afternoon, the sky changed. Not with rain. With dust. A dark brown wall appeared on the horizon. At first, villagers stared in confusion. Then the wind hit. Violent. Sudden. Terrifying. The dust storm swallowed everything. People ran for shelter, covering their faces. Children screamed as the air turned black. Trees bent dangerously. Roofs tore away. And the few remaining crops, already weak, were ripped out of the earth completely. Fields vanished beneath swirling dirt. 4 hours, the storm raged. When it finally passed, silence followed. The village looked destroyed. Nothing remained. No crops. No food. No hope. Many villagers fell to their knees. Some began praying. Others simply cried. "This is the end," an old man whispered. And for a moment, it felt true. But then something unexpected happened. From the edge of the village, through the settling dust, a single figure appeared. Kofi. His clothes were covered in dirt. His face looked exhausted. But his eyes were steady. Without saying a word, he raised his hand and motioned for the villagers to follow him. At first, nobody moved. Then the chief stepped forward. And slowly, the others followed. Kofi led them beyond the ruined fields, past the dry wells, toward the forest. The villagers walked in silence, confused and suspicious. Then they stopped. Gasps spread through the crowd. Before them stood something impossible. Green. Bright. Alive. Kofi's hidden farm. Healthy crops stretched across the clearing. Rows of strong maize. Beans climbing naturally along wooden poles. Sweet potatoes growing beneath rich dark soil. Even fruit trees showed signs of life. It looked like another world. People stared in disbelief. How? Someone whispered. Children ran toward the plants with wide eyes. Women covered their mouths in shock. The chief stepped closer, speechless. Then Kofi knelt beside one of the irrigation channels. He pulled aside a layer of soil and revealed a small stream of water flowing quietly underground. The villagers gasped again. "I preserved water beneath the surface," Kofi explained calmly. "The sun cannot steal what it cannot see." He pointed toward the carefully built channels. "These are natural irrigation paths. My father taught me the old designs. They guide moisture where it's needed." Then he touched the soil gently. And this land was allowed to rest. "I gave it time to heal." The crowd looked at him differently now. Not with mockery. With shock. The useless farmer had done what none of them could. He had survived. And more than that, he had found a way to save them. The chief slowly stepped forward. His shoulders, once proud and rigid, now looked heavy. For the first time in years, he lowered his head. "Kofi," he said quietly, "I was wrong." The entire village froze. The chief swallowed hard. "My pride blinded me. My decisions helped destroy this land." His voice cracked. "My family is starving. My people are starving." He looked directly into Kofi's eyes. "Please, help us." The words hung in the air. Kofi said nothing. Inside him, old pain came rushing back. The insults. The laughter. The humiliation. The destroyed farm. Kojo's cruel words. The villagers turning their backs on him again and again. A part of him wanted to walk away. To let them feel what he had felt. To let them suffer. His hands tightened. His breathing slowed. Then another memory returned. His mother's weak face. His little brother's hunger. The promise he made years ago. Never again. Slowly, his anger softened. And Kofi made his choice. Not revenge. Mercy. He turned toward the villagers. "We begin today," he said firmly. No one moved. They listened. First, stop wasting water. Every drop matters. He showed them how to dig shallow catch channels to trap morning moisture. Second, never force the same crop on the same soil every season. He explained crop rotation. How different plants restored different nutrients. Third, respect the land. He looked at each of them carefully. The earth is not your servant. It is your partner. Some villagers began crying openly. One woman fell to her knees. "Forgive us," she whispered. Even Kojo stood quietly at the back, unable to meet Kofi's eyes. Not everyone trusted him immediately. Some still whispered. Some doubted. But hunger leaves little room for pride. Soon they all began working. And Kofi worked harder than anyone. Day and night. He shared food from his hidden farm. He taught families how to build underground water channels. He helped children plant new seeds. He carried water to the elderly. He fed people who once laughed at him. And slowly, the village began to breathe again. Not because of power. Not because of wealth. but because one humble farmer chose compassion over revenge. The days after Kofi revealed his hidden farm changed the village completely. For the first time in years, people worked together instead of fighting. Men who once argued over water now dug irrigation channels side by side. Women carefully planted new crops using Kofi's methods. Even children carried small buckets of water to young plants each morning before the heat grew stronger. The village was still weak. People were still hungry. But something important had returned. Hope. One evening, the villagers gathered beneath the old baobab tree again. This time, there was no shouting, no blame, only silence and reflection. An elderly man named Baba Tendo slowly stood before the crowd. His back was bent with age, and his voice trembled slightly, but his eyes remained sharp. "I have stayed silent for too long," he said quietly. The villagers listened carefully. Baba Tendo looked toward Kofi. "Many of you are too young to remember," he continued, "but Kofi's father once saved this village." Whispers spread through the crowd. The old man pointed toward the dry fields surrounding them. Years ago, another famine came to this land. Crops failed. Water disappeared. Just like now. He paused heavily. But Kofi's father understood the earth. He taught us how to protect the soil, how to save water underground, and how to plant crops without destroying the land. Several elders slowly lowered their heads in shame. "We followed his teachings for many years," Baba Tendo admitted, "and the village prospered." The crowd remained silent. Then greed entered our hearts. His voice hardened painfully. We wanted faster harvests, bigger profits, easier methods. We stopped respecting the land because we believed money and chemicals could replace wisdom. He shook his head sadly. "And now we have repeated the same mistake." The truth hit the villagers hard. Many could no longer meet Kofi's eyes. Everything they mocked him for had been the very thing that could have saved them from the beginning. The village chief slowly stepped forward. He looked older now, weaker. The disaster had broken the pride inside him. Before everyone, he removed the necklace that symbolized his authority as chief. Then, to the shock of the crowd, he bowed his head toward Kofi. "My pride nearly destroyed this village," he confessed. His voice cracked with emotion. "I cared more about appearing strong than listening to wisdom." Tears filled his tired eyes. "I blamed an innocent man while the real problem was our own greed." The crowd became emotional. Some villagers openly cried. Others stared at the ground in shame. Then something unexpected happened. Kojo slowly walked forward. The same man who humiliated Kofi before the entire village. The same man who mocked him during his darkest moments. Kojo stopped directly in front of Kofi. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Kojo lowered his head. "I was cruel to you," he said quietly. "I mocked your pain because I was blinded by my own pride." His voice trembled. "And I believe I was one of the people who destroyed your hidden farm." Gasps spread through the crowd. Kojo looked deeply ashamed. "I thought you were weak," he whispered. "But you were stronger than all of us." For several long seconds, silence filled the air. Then Kofi placed a hand gently on Kojo's shoulder. "We were all afraid," he said softly. "Fear makes people forget who they are." Kojo's eyes filled with tears. Nearby, several children slowly approached Kofi. These were the same boys who once laughed and chased him through the streets. Now they looked at him with admiration. One small boy stepped forward nervously. "Can you teach us how to grow crops like yours?" he asked. For the first time in a long while, Kofi smiled warmly. "Yes," he answered. Families began thanking him openly. Women brought him handmade food as gratitude. Fathers shook his hand with respect. Elderly villagers blessed him with trembling voices. The useless farmer had become the village's greatest hope. But despite the growing respect around him, something still weighed heavily inside Kofi's heart. The next morning, before sunrise, he quietly left the village alone. He walked toward the hillside cemetery beyond the forest. The air was calm and cool. Birds sang softly in distant trees. Kofi stopped before two simple graves covered with weathered stones. His mother. His father. For a long moment, he simply stood there in silence. Then his emotions finally broke. Tears rolled down his face as years of pain came rushing out all at once. "I tried so hard," he whispered shakily. He fell to his knees beside the graves. There were times I wanted to give up, times I thought everyone was right about me. His voice cracked completely. But you were right, Father. He touched the soil gently. The land remembers. Kofi cried openly for the first time in many years. Not only from grief, but from relief. His father's wisdom had survived after all. Not through books, not through stories, but through action, through compassion, through the people now learning to heal the land together. Days slowly turned into weeks, and little by little, the village began changing. Green returned to the fields. New irrigation systems carried water safely underground. Farmers rotated crops carefully instead of exhausting the soil. Trees were planted near rivers to protect moisture. People shared resources instead of hoarding them. Cooperation replaced greed. And as the village healed, so did Kofi. Then one evening, something incredible happened. Amma looked toward the sky and suddenly froze. "Brother," she whispered. Kofi turned slowly. Far above the village, dark clouds were gathering. Real rain clouds. The wind shifted gently across the fields. Villagers stepped outside their homes one by one, staring upward in disbelief. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The entire village held its breath as thunder rumbled softly in the distance for the very first time in years. The entire village stood beneath the darkening sky in complete silence. Nobody wanted to speak too soon. For years, they had prayed for this moment. For years, clouds had come and disappeared without mercy. But this time felt different. The wind carried the cool scent of rain across the dry land. The trees swayed gently. Thunder rolled again in the distance, deeper now. Kofi stood quietly among the villagers, staring upward. Beside him, Amma squeezed his hand tightly. Then, a single drop fell. A woman gasped softly as the water touched her face. Another drop followed. Then another. Within seconds, rain began pouring from the sky. Real rain. Heavy. Cold. Beautiful. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Then joy exploded across the village. People cried out with happiness. Children laughed and danced barefoot through the muddy streets. Mothers lifted their faces toward the sky, tears mixing with rainwater. Some villagers fell to their knees, thanking God aloud. Others simply stood still, overwhelmed by emotion. The dry earth quickly drank the water like a starving child finally receiving food. Kofi closed his eyes as rain soaked his face. For years, he had carried pain, shame, and loneliness inside him. Now, standing beneath the storm, it felt as though the heavens themselves were washing those wounds away. The village chief slowly stepped forward through the rain. This time, there was no pride in his voice, only respect. "Everyone," he called loudly. The villagers turned toward him. The chief looked at Kofi with deep emotion. "There was a time when we mocked this man," he admitted. "We called him weak, useless, cursed." Shame spread across many faces. But while we chased greed and easy success, Kofi protected the wisdom that saved us. The chief raised his hand toward him. He saved this village when all hope was lost. The crowd became emotional. Then, one by one, villagers began clapping. Slowly at first, then louder, stronger. Children smiled proudly at Kofi. Elders nodded with respect. Some villagers cried openly while applauding the man they once rejected. Kofi stood quietly, humbled by it all. He never imagined this day would come. But even now, he did not allow pride to enter his heart. When the applause finally faded, Kofi stepped forward gently. "The land did not survive because of me alone," he said calmly over the sound of rain. The villagers listened carefully. It survived because people finally chose to care for one another again. He looked around at every face. When greed ruled our hearts, the land suffered with us. The rain continued falling steadily across the village. But when we shared water, shared work, and protected the earth together, Kofi continued softly, life returned. Silence filled the air. Not a heavy silence. A peaceful one. The next morning, the village woke to a different world. The dusty ground had turned dark and rich with moisture. Tiny streams flowed gently through the irrigation channels Kofi had taught them to build. And for the first time in years, the people planted together. Men dug rows into the softened earth while women carefully placed seeds into the soil. Children carried water buckets happily from one field to another. No one fought. No one argued over ownership. The village had become a family again. Kofi walked through the fields quietly, helping wherever he was needed. Sometimes he corrected a planting method gently. Other times he simply smiled as villagers worked side by side. Then a small voice called out behind him, "Kofi." He turned and saw one of the young boys who had once mocked him in the streets. The child held a small farming tool awkwardly in his hands. His face looked nervous. "Will you teach me how to farm like you?" the boy asked softly. For a moment, Kofi simply stared at him. Then a warm smile slowly crossed his face. Not because the boy admired him, but because the future finally held hope again. Kofi knelt beside him and placed a hand gently on the child's shoulder. "Yes," he said quietly, "I will teach you." The boy smiled brightly, and together they walked toward the fields. Above them, rain continued falling over the village that once stood broken and barren. Now, little by little, green life began spreading across the land once more. And in the middle of it all stood the farmer they once rejected. The man who never stopped believing the earth could heal if people learned to heal with it.